Hello, everybody. Good to see you here. I'm very excited to be doing this stream today with you guys joining. Um, Before we get into it, while people begin to join, just update you with a wee bit of news. So you may already hear the difference here, but I have purchased a new microphone. I've given in to the cries of the comments decrying my awful sound quality. And I guess for a year almost now, people have been saying, we can't hear you, or it's been muffled, and so on. So I decided to finally take the plunge, and I bought myself a new microphone. It arrived yesterday. It's a Rode NT, and it looks very fancy. I have no idea whether it's going to be better or not. So please let me know in the comments whether you think it's better. And yeah, hopefully it's going to improve the quality of my streams for all you listeners out there. So, and before we plunge into the topic today, we update on the Needle's Eye, or the rock that I go to, and I give a wee update every week on what's been going on there. So last week, actually, why I was away, was that I took a friend down there who hadn't been before, and she was blown away. There was so many seabirds. The guillemots and razorbills are still there, squawking away, shuffling along the shelves. We saw about 8 cormorants, and they're beautiful birds with and I could definitely see they were cormorants this time because they had the white cheeks on them. And they were it was quite a rough day in the sea. So it was very dramatic seeing all these birds there. Very special. So yeah, that's where we were last time. And hopefully I'll be able to get out again this week. Although today it's quite rainy, and it looks like there's going to be a lot of rain the next few days. So hopefully it will dry up a bit, and then we'll be able to get out. Classic British summer. As always, feel free to put your comments in the chat as we go through, and I'll try and engage with them at various points during the discussion of what's going on. Hello to you, Matthew, from the States. I hope you're having a good day. I don't know what time it is for you, but whatever time it is, I hope it's a good morning, afternoon, or evening. Yeah, so today, the topic that I wanted to get into was the brilliance of the music of Bob Dylan, or at least for some of the songs. It's well known that Dylan's lyrics are quite exceptional. Many people have commented on how brilliant his lyrical writing is, the imagery he can conjure, the words he puts together, and how they fit into songs. It's just spectacular. The paintings he can create in your mind are fantastic. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature as a consequence of this. And many people have done critical analyses of the words of many of his songs. Some come to mind. It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, Desolation Row, Hard Rain, Tangled Up in Blue. The list could go on. There's many fantastic sets of lyrics. And indeed, some have even compared Dylan to people such as Shakespeare and Mozart, particularly for his writing and the words of his songs, but also the way he sings his songs. The interpretation he gives is quite unique, but it brings so much to it. And of course, one of the things you find with Dylan is he's always reinterpreting his songs. He's always giving new versions of them when he performs them on his never-ending tour. So there's always something new to discover within the words that he's written. So this is a common theme in Dylan's work, and how people have understood Dylan, primarily as a lyricist. However, the important thing to note here is Dylan isn't a poet, strictly speaking, or he may be a poet, but his poetry isn't what you find in a book. It's not like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Rather, he's a songwriter. His words are always fitted to tunes and with harmonies and melodies. And I think one of the things that's often missed when we focus purely on his words is the fact that that it's because they're songs that they're so powerful. Indeed, we may even wonder whether the words themselves are as good if they're just by themselves. It's that conjunction which makes listening to Dylan so wonderful. And part of this has been inspired by reading a bit of Roger Scruton, the late English philosopher. Scruton wrote quite a lot on the philosophy of music, and in his most seminal work on the philosophy of music, he makes the argument, rather unpopular point of view today, but as we'll see, was quite common in the ancient, medieval, and a Renaissance world, that music embodies emotion and values. There's something about the way that the notes and rhythms and the way it's performed come together, which can sonically manifest to a listener a set of values. So Scruton gives the example of Elgar's Nimrod. Now, whether or not you think it's a good piece, there's a consensus that when we listen to Elgar's Nimrod, there's a sense of nobility, courage, solemnity that comes through this music. And Scruton would say this is true of all music. And so we can assess the moral value of music depending on the emotions or attitudes it seeks to display. This is a rather controversial point because then you can start ranking music as morally good or morally bad, and this is tied to its beauty. Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? And many people do not want to say some music is better than another in our culture, because that implies there's an aesthetic standard. But Scruton says there is. And so the task of the music critic is not to just give a vague sense of, oh, this music makes me feel a certain way, or has this attitude in a kind of vague sense, but rather to say what it is about the music you're listening to which creates in us this sense that this music manifests this emotion. So you have to look at its melodies, its harmonies, its instrumentation, the way it's been performed in a specific setting, and so on. It's the combination of all these things. What specifically makes this music embody this emotion or value? And in doing so, we get a better analysis of the music we're listening to and better understanding of why it evokes in us certain emotions. So this video, I guess, is my first stab at this. Scruton has, in the second half of the philosophy of music book he writes, a whole list of case studies that he goes through. It's like Wagner and so on. And these are really amazing studies. I can't hope to possibly match him. He was a great scholar of music. But what I hope to do with Shelter from the Storm by Dylan, and if we have time, Tangled Up in Blue, is give a sense of some of the musical things that are going on in those songs, which help to cultivate the emotions and indeed augment what's expressed in the lyrics, thereby hoping to communicate why Dylan's so great, not just as a lyricist, but as a songwriter of words and music, at least in these cases. Before we get into that, though, I want to turn first to changes in music which were brought about in the Renaissance and Reformation eras. This will help us to see more clearly what Dylan's doing with these songs. So, in the Renaissance, around 1500 onwards, you had a group of scholars primarily who are now known as humanists, and their primary focus was a return to the classics. They wanted to read classical texts in their original languages and thus restore the great benefits of classical civilization. This was at a time when many of the classical texts were being rediscovered. They'd been lost for centuries. These people included Erasmus, Zarlino, and so on. And one of the things that they shared in common, or a value that came from their reading of these classical texts, was a focus on rhetoric and indeed an elevation of the spoken word. For them, words have the power to to move the soul, to create emotion. And following the classical text, they wanted to elevate speech as a form of education. This they brought into their theories of music. Prior to this period, in general, music was sung in Latin, particularly in a religious context, in Latin, and it was melismatic. That means that a word might be sung over many notes, or one syllable will be sung over many notes. Think of something like, I know this is a later piece, but Allegri's Miserere might be an example of this. It was also, so the word is not the most important thing in such a piece. It is the tune or the melody or the harmonies which are the primary thing that the audience is listening to. And this is particularly the case if it's in Latin, because most people couldn't speak Latin during this period. So what's drawing their attention in worship? It's the tune. People like Zarlino want to say, no, the text is most important. It has priority in the song. So one of the big changes here is music becomes generally syllabic. That means that you match one syllable to one note, or roughly speaking, that would be the case. And the harmonies become homophonic. That means the various parts move together in block harmony. Or it becomes monophonic. That means that there is just one part moving all the way through. It's no longer polyphonic, where you've got different parts moving out of time with each other, or independently of each other would be a better way of putting it. So you have these shifts to prioritize the words of a song. And this is carried over into the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Whether it be Luther's Germany, Calvin's Geneva, or English Tudor Protestantism, one of the big things is that they want to return the word of God to the people. They want people to hear the word of God in their native tongue. They want people to be able to access it and read it for themselves. This is, for them, is important because the word of God is God's revelation. And it has the power to trigger cognitive, emotional, and behavioral change. In other words, conversion, which is key for the process of salvation. As God's word is God's authoritative revelation of who he is, what he has done, what he demands of human beings, it becomes vital for knowing what God has done. So moving away from the Catholic tradition of the Vulgate in Latin, and also the Catholic emphasis on the church as the primary interpreter of scripture, reformers want all people to be able to understand the word of God and be changed by it. So they turn to music because they realize that most people can't read. So you can't just give them a Bible in English because they're not going to understand it. Moreover, these cultures were very musical. People loved singing at home, in the workplace, in the tavern. It was quite common to hear song wherever you went. So by harnessing the people's love of music and adapting it to this purpose, they'll be able to engage with the Bible. So what they did is they introduced hymns and, at least in the Calvinist case, metrical psalms. So these were the 150 psalms put in meter and set to very memorable and easily sung tunes. In Scotland, which is the context I know best, in 1564, the Kirk released its own Psalter containing the 150 psalms set to 105 tunes, or proper tunes. And these, by and large, remained consistent until 1640. So a long, long time, this kind of musical repertoire remained. And it was the primary music of public worship. Now, importantly, it was syllabic, so every note was tied to a syllable. It was in the vernacular, so in Scots or English. And the harmonies, people did sing harmonies to them, were homophonic. So this all meant that the words were easy to engage with. They were intelligible, they were comprehensible, and thus people could understand what they were singing. And why is this important? Well, this shift to the spoken word or the sung word is reflected in modern pop music. Most of the songs we listen to, the words are very important to defining the meaning of the song. Indeed, they take priority. And certainly with Dylan's lyrics, they become the centerpiece of the songs that we listen to. If you there's no songs by Dylan or major songs by Dylan where it's just an abstract set of words that you can't understand or are unintelligible. No, we hear all the words that are being sung. So this change in the Renaissance and Reformation is still pretty much there in most sung music. But there's another key thing about the metrical psalms which should draw our attention before getting into Dylan. Jeremy Begbie, a theologian and scholar of music, has pointed out that in the French Psalter, so that's the Genevan Psalter, the words do not follow natural speech patterns. Indeed, this is surprising because if the priority is making the word of God intelligible and kind of as close to ordinary people's understandings of speech as possible, you would think that you would try and make it so that the melodies fit how you would normally say these lines. And indeed, when you look at Luther's hymns or Lutheran hymns, they tend to have that focus much more. By contrast, the metrical psalms, the rhythms and the meters don't fit natural speech patterns. In the Scottish context, this is even more accentuated by the fact that they're trying to adapt French, Italian, German meters to Scottish words. And so there was often a discrepancy between what was sung, trying to fit too many syllables in, and the tunes that were being sung. So much so that in 1601, King James urged the church to write a new psalter, and he himself wrote his own version of the Psalms, published in 1631 by his son, King Charles I, which he hoped would replace the original Psalter. However, this wasn't just bad songwriting. It wasn't just because they failed to execute the combination of text and melody, although in some cases that's arguable. Rather, Begbie points out that the music of the Psalms was meant to emotionally express the content of the lyrics. I'll repeat that. The music of the Psalms was supposed to express musically, so melodically and harmonically, the emotional content of the Psalms. In early modern musical theory, based on kind of ancient thought of Pythagoras and Aristotle, there's a widespread consensus that music, due to its movement of melody and pitch and rhythm, could embody emotion. And this was kind of codified in the idea of musical modes. Now, a mode is a kind of scale, but also kind of patterns of playing intervals and cadences. And each of these 7 modes was thought to embody certain emotions if you played in that way. And when we look at the Scottish Psalter, I should say, as I mentioned, there's 105 proper tunes, that is 105 tunes tied to 105 psalms of the 150 psalms from a variety of modes. And the point of this is to try and tie melodically certain emotional expressions with certain lyrics, is to capture the emotional range of the whole Psalter, so that when people sung these psalms, they weren't just focusing on the words, but the tunes they enjoyed and reveled in express something of the psalmist's emotions too. There was a musical independence from the lyrics. We can see this. Just give you two examples here. So Psalm 42 is one, I guess you could say, of unrequited thirst for God. In some ways, it's a lament at one's own condition for not being thirsted by, of not seeking God, and one's desire for God not being satisfied because of one's own sinfulness. At least that's how the Scots kind of framed it in the Psalter. So I'm just going to sing a verse of it, and you might get a sense of the tune of how there's this lamenting aspect to it, this kind of self-frustration, but also a degree of hope that if one draws near to the living God, one will find that thirst that they seek satisfied. Like as the herder's breath and bray, the war springs still obtain. Say, does my soul desire away with thee, Lord, to remain? My soul does thirst and would draw near the living God Almighty. Och, when shall I come and appear in presence of his seat? By contrast, let's look at Psalm 100, or the Old Hundredth. It's still used today in many churches around the world, but it originates from the Scottish Psalter, and it's got a very famous tune. You'll probably recognize it. O people that on earth they dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice, himself with mouth his praise forth tell. Come ye afore him and rejoice. The Lord ye know is God indeed. We utterate he did us make. We are his flock, he does us feed. For his sheep does us take. This latter one you can see is a much more triumphant, rousing, rejoicing melody, and it fits very neatly with the words. So you can see then that just in these two examples, the melody communicates much of the emotional expression of the psalm. So even if you didn't engage with the words or weren't paying attention to the words, you get a sense of what's going on here in your relationship with God. At least that's how they would have functioned to a certain degree. And part of what the argument in this stream will be is that Dylan's doing a similar thing with the melodies and harmonies of Shelter from the Storm and Tangled Up in Blue. Independently of the lyrics, or perhaps in complementing the lyrics, the melodies and harmonies express something of the emotion and the values and the atmosphere that Dylan's trying to convey through his words. In so doing, they augment it, they give it more power and fervency. You can almost touch what he feels through this music. And so that's partly why Shelter from the Storm is so great and Tangled Up in Blue, because it doesn't just hit us with the words, it hits us with the music. So without further ado, let's get into Shelter from the Storm. Clinton Heylin has described Shelter from the Storm as mythic, or mythological. I think that's a really good place to begin. I'm going to start with a brief summary of the lyrics, and then we'll get into the melodies themselves. Begins, 'twas in another lifetime. It's like once upon a time in a land far, far away. I guess it's a twist on that. And so that kind of mythological aspect already jumps out at us. But we also, and the setting isn't a great place. It's a vicious, despairing, dark and evil place, really. A place where steel-eyed death abounds, that there's darkness and the road was full of mud. It's not a pleasant place. It's a place where Dylan's narrator describes himself as persecuted in language which is distinctly religious. He talks about how he has a crown of thorns, or Christ had a crown of thorns, and that his persecutors gambled for his clothes. This is something that happened to Christ before his crucifixion, is the guards gambled for his clothes. And he asked for salvation and he got a lethal dose. So these are all kind of indicators that this isn't, it's a kind of sacralizing of this experience. It's raising it up beyond ordinary experience into a world, a mythological world, a sacred world, or at least drawing on those sacred references, resonances even, to put this in a place beyond time in some ways, in a place where lost to history in some sense, and connecting it with the divine. This is nowhere more clear than in Dylan's descriptions of the beautiful woman who offers him shelter from this storm. This woman, he describes as offering a safe and warm place, that there's only safe and warm with her, that she wears silver bracelets on her wrists and flowers in her hair, and that she's born with God. So this woman is connected in some ways with this various mythological archetypes. You could look at maybe someone like Diana or Athena, Mary, the mother of God. Or you could even see maybe in literature, I know last time I was looking at Tolkien, so somebody like Galadriel would be an example, or in The Princess and the Goblin, the queen or the great-grandmother of the princess, the grandmother of the princess. And it's quite striking, actually. All of the, certainly Galadriel and the grandmother I was just talking about, in all the characters, they evoke wonderful emotions of hope, calm, joy, awe, and love, deep love and affection. And that's what this woman brings for Dylan's narrator. She offers this just goodness to him through her love, which I guess this is a metaphor for. And from this beauty that he is welcomed into, this acceptance, this place of refuge, he loves her back. However, this has been lost. He tells us that now there's a wall between us, something has been lost. He's now in a foreign country. And this all came about because of his fault. He got his signals crossed, he says. So he's lost this beautiful woman and the hope and salvation she offered. And he's turned out into this world again, this horrible world filled of just darkness and evil and doom and forlorn. There's nothing good in it. She was the refuge and he lost it. He hopes to get it back. He hopes to reclaim this memory, to turn back the clock. He also hopes to make beauty his. Someday I'll make it mine, he says. But he hasn't got it yet. So where we are with this song then is it's a song about the past, or a past memory, another lifetime ago, about this kind of mythological story of the narrator and this beautiful woman, and how he has lost her love and he wants to reclaim it. So it's tinged with, it's not just a story being told with a happy ending or in the present. It's always looking back. It's always tinged with remorse and with hope. So that gives us a sense of the lyrics of Dylan. Indeed, many people have looked at them, and if you want further examination, I encourage you to look at them for more detailed studies. So what about the music itself? How does that feed in? Well, The song is made up of 3 chords. Only 3 chords are needed for this, and I'll tell you what they are. So you've got 1, 5, and 4. That's the basic setup. So your tonic, which is the first chord in the key, your dominant, which is the 5th chord in the key, and your subdominant, which is the 4th chord in the key. And these are really the basic building blocks of any song, or most songs at least. They're very typical, and you could make many songs out of these 4 chords. Indeed, the 12-bar blues and many blues songs use them. Most pop songs will probably use them, maybe with an additional chord thrown in. But it's very simple, very stripped back. And this can give us the impression that this is a rather compositionally simple song. It's far from the case, but it gives us that. Superficially, we can see that. So I'm just going to play a couple of verses, and you'll be able to hear the simplicity. So let me just get into position. And I'm playing in the key of C. 'Twas in another lifetime, one of toil and blood, when blackness was a virtue and the road was full of mud. I came in from the wilderness, a creature void of form. Come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. And if I pass this way again, you can rest assured I'll always do my best for her, on that I give my word. In a world of steel-eyed earth and men who are fighting to go on, come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. So you can see, it sounds pretty simple. C, G, F is the basic chordal progression, and it fits quite nicely. It gives it this feeling of being in a kind of a folk song from of yore, which ties in with this. It's very traditional and very stripped back. In the initial recordings, it's just a guitar with a bass added in, so it gives this sense of a very traditional song from a time beyond, from past times, which ties into this notion of it being of this kind of mythology, being in the past as well. One of the key things that runs through the song is what's called a plagal cadence. That is any kind of set of so a cadence is a movement of chords, typically at the end of a phrase. So the classic cadence, I should say before getting into that, music kind of begins with your tonic. So this is the first chord in this key C. And all music in general is a movement from the tonic out away from it and then returning back. So a simple kind of cadence begins. So you've got your C and then the dominant. So this dominant is kind of midway away from the tonic, and it wants to return back to home. Its destination wants to return. It's kind of left open and hoping to go back to the tonic. And that's called an authentic cadence. And it's probably the most standard, classic, and traditional cadence. It's very strong and definitive. There's a strong sense of resolution through it. It's very clear and decisive. And it's a good way of ending a phrase or a piece of music. The plagal cadence is 4-1. So in this case, F to C. The last one was G to C. So and it's often called the Amen chord, because when you listen to many 19th century hymns, when you hear the words Amen at the end of these hymns, it's a plagal cadence. Amen. Now, automatically, this resonance of the plagal cadence will put in our minds subconsciously or at some level this connection with hymns, thus giving us a sense of the warmth and acceptance that we find in God, this sense of resolution, of kind of the end of things. It ties in with the sacred element of these hymns, is then imported into this song. And as we've seen with the lyrics, they're trying to connect with the sacred, at least in the Christian tradition. So this plagal cadence really relates us to that. And this is seen throughout the song. I'll point it out. So I'm going to play the chords of the song now without the lyrics, and I'll point out where you've got plagal cadences. So the first phrase. So this is our first plagal cadence. And the second one's coming in a second. And here's our last one. And here's our last one. So there's 4 plagal cadences for the 4 lines. The first line, it's at the very end of the phrase. The second one connects the second and third lines. So it's the end of the second and beginning of the third. The third one is the end of the third line going into the beginning of the fourth. And the final one is the end of the fourth line. So we have 4 plagal cadences. So this connection with the sacred runs throughout, and the acceptance and warmth I was mentioning. However, there is a kind of caveat to all of this. The plagal cadence is a much weaker sound than the authentic cadence. Let me just play them again so you can hear the difference. So here's the plagal cadence. And here's the authentic cadence. Whereas the authentic cadence is very decisive and strong in its kind of do, 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 the plagal cadence has a bit of ambiguity about it. And this is because if we moved into the key of F, well, F to C would actually be tonic to dominant. So we actually end up with a strange situation where this plagal cadence could sound like the tonic to dominant of another key. This introduces a sense of ambiguity and doubt into the song, which means that for our purposes here, what Dylan's trying to do here is he's conveying that there is a tension or how to put it, this isn't something that is totally sure. The dominant to tonic cadence is quite clear and robust. There's a bit of tentativeness. There is a wee bit lost here. And it conveys that sense of this is a memory that he's clinging on to, but he's not sure he'll get it back. It feeds into that. So the plagal cadence isn't just about the connection with the sacred and the mythological and the loveliness of this woman. It's actually introducing an element of I'm trying to find the right word here. I'm sure he would. That sense of distance and the lack of certainty that's inherent in this song, the possibility of change and the loss of this place. So that's all in this plagal cadence, which I think is really fantastic writing if you're wanting to convey that sense that this is a memory of something that's been lost, but he's hoping to get it back. This is even so we've seen that there's plagal cadences throughout, and if we go back then to the structure of the song, the first line is a complete phrase. That is, it has a beginning, middle, and end which tie up nicely. Was in another lifetime, one of toil and blood. So we start at the tonic, go to the dominant, subdominant, back to the tonic. Starts at home, returns to home. It's very complete, and it gives that sense that this is an initial statement to the verse. The next line, when blackness was a virtue and the road was full of mud. So you see we end on the subdominant here rather than the tonic. That means it's an open phrase. It's giving us a question musically that needs an answer. It's looking for resolution, which we find at the beginning of the third line. In a world of steel-eyed the men who are fighting to be warm. So the beginning of that phrase completes the former phrase, but then we have a really interesting ending to this phrase, probably the most musically interesting part of the whole song. The melody clashes with the harmony. And this isn't just Dylan's mistake here. You might think he's a bit ropey on keeping the tune, or he moves about wildly often. But no, I've double checked. I've looked at the kind of official sheet music that he's kind of authorized, and also just various recordings and other versions of the songs. This is definitely the way that he intended it. At least it seems that way, at least. So you have the chord F, the fourth chord. That's the end of this phrase. But in the melody, one sings a G. So, initially I was actually playing it wrong because I thought that it should return to a different chord. So you could play it like this. It doesn't sound right, but just hear it out. So, in a world of steel-eyed the men who are fighting to be warm. So that would harmonically be more consonant than what he wants. However, he wants the singer, to be singing a G, and the chord at the end to be an F. Really pay attention and try and listen to it this time. In a world of steel-eyed the men who are fighting to be warm. So what you've got is the F and the G. So a really nice clash, but because it's in different instruments, so you've got in his case it would be the guitar and the bass, and the singer singing the G, it doesn't sound as awful as that. Rather, it has a certain softness to it, but also really brings through this dissonance in the song. Now, why would he want to put dissonance on this point? Well, this is what we call a suspension, and I'll go into more detail with what that means in Tangled Up in Blue. But what the suspension does is it introduces a clash within the chord, and this clash creates musical tension. We need it to be resolved either way. So you want your chords resolved to the tonic, but this tension as well, we want to move away from the dissonance back into consonance, back into music which is coherent and isn't clashing with each other. And what this does is it increases this sense of doubt, of emotional torment or pain. It undercuts what is said to a certain degree. And it undercuts what's being said with the authentic cadence. Because remember, the 5-1, the authentic cadence, is actually going to be in the melody here, because in the melody I'm singing the G, which is the fifth, and then going to the tonic. So by undercutting it or bringing a bit of ambiguity to it, Dylan's trying to introduce this sense of loss again, this pain, and that this is something that's been lost and it hurts. What's really genius about this, though, is it isn't just a clash for the sake of a clash. Both the F, so the F and the G, resolve in the tonic, which is, in this case, C. So both the harmony and the tune are resolved through the next cadence. So, in a world of still-eyed men who are fighting to be warm, come in, she said, I give you shelter from the storm. That come in, she said, that moment resolves the tension that we've just felt in the previous line, which is often something to do with the darkness of the outside world, or some of the futility that Dylan's been feeling. It finds its place of rest and consonance in the next line, the fourth line, which is always throughout the song this constant refrain, come in, she said, I'll give you shelter from the storm, which is itself a complete phrase with a beginning and an end back in the tonic. So this whole phrase, you could see, is resolving this tension that Dylan is expressing musically through this clash of the melody and the harmony in the third line. It's always doing that, and that helps to create this constant sense that the place that this woman has, her home that she's offered to Dylan, is this place of safety, of resolution of this emotional pain. It's being displayed musically here through the resolution of the melody and the harmony in this phrase. And so I think that's really important for then understanding this song, that throughout we've got ambiguity and tension through the plagal cadences, connecting us with a sense of the mythological or the sacred. We have musical resolution of dissonance and of cadences which point towards the security and the beauty of this woman's love that Dylan wants to get back. And so you have, through the music, a sense of memory, loss, and hope cultivated. That's really quite special to do with 3 chords just being played in sequence. That's really clever. And I think it speaks volumes to what Dylan does with Shelter from the Storm. So that's a wee breakdown of the musical quality of Shelter from the Storm. Before I go on to Tangled Up in Blue, because we've got plenty of time for that, I'm going to have a look at the comments and see what people have been saying, and feel free to put anything else in there that you feel like. Hello again, Matthew, and thank you for staying. I appreciate it very much. It means a lot. Like Dylan, meant the ear, not the eye. Yeah, I can agree with that. I think that's right. I think some people would say he's like Shakespeare in so far as the quality of his work as well. That's a huge question, and I guess you can only really assess it after hundreds of years. Certainly that was the case with Shakespeare. Hello, John, Missouri. Really great to see you. That certainly sounds right to me, and a lot of what he does is it's very pointed at people around him. Great to hear where you both are from. I'm glad that to have folks from all over the world tuning in. Yes, and honestly, I could have kept singing those psalms. They're just so beautiful to hear the praise of God. The Geneva Bible was already the first study Bible in 1560 with a complete study apparatus and unique for a Protestant Bible, the complete Apocrypha. Yes, indeed. And one of the great things about the Geneva Bible is that you actually get various traditions. I'm sure you know this, John, in the sense that some of them come with certain reading aids which are designed for the less theologically educated and those who might struggle to read. So they are really helpful for kind of basic learning. However, you get more advanced versions of the Geneva Bible, typically in the Roman typeface. The others are in the black typeface. And they come with more advanced reading aids and are targeted towards the theologically literate and advanced, and potentially wealthier as well. So you actually end up with multiple versions of the Geneva Bible, not so much in its text, but in the notes that come with them, targeted towards certain individuals and markets, which I think is absolutely wonderful that they were conscious of the educational needs of their readers and how to try and reach everybody with God's word. It's really amazing. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, it's quite incredible, particularly when you think that, well, certainly in Scotland, you reach a certain point in the early 17th century where, at least in the lowlands, many parishes could say with confidence that most of our parishioners have access to Bibles in their families, in their households. So this is being widely read, it's being engaged with on a daily basis. It's very much sustaining lay piety and forming a huge swathe of culture. It's an incredible thing. Maybe one day we'll need to do a stream on the Geneva Bible. It definitely merits a view. So, without further ado, I'll jump into Tangled Up in Blue, which is another cracker from Dylan. Let me get to the right page for this. I've got all my notes here over the page, just trying to get to the right one. Because this one is a lot more technically brilliant, you might say, than the Shelter from the Storms. Shelter from the Storms did some really interesting things and was very creative in its way of kind of expressing emotion. This is Tangled Up in Blue, the headline act of Blood on the Tracks, which is the album that it's from, and so Shelter from the Storm. This one really brings with it some quite complex musical brilliance. And I'm going to play through a verse. Oh, but before I do that, let me just summarize. Roughly speaking, the song is a love story, and it follows the story of the narrator, in this case, could be Dylan, could be somebody else, through various situations with this woman that he's with, who he loses, who he gets back with, and wants to return to. There's a number of vignettes, number of situations. It's kind of a story of his whole life, in some ways, a mythology, and it leaves again on a note of lost love, but hope of getting it back. So there's a lot of similarity with Shelter from the Storm in that regard, although it's a narrative with these similar emotions inbuilt into it. And lyrically, it's absolutely stunning. It's just wonderful what he does with it. There's little quirks here and there. There's beautiful images. There's moments that surprise you, all coming back to the refrain, Tangled Up in Blue, which is in itself quite an evocative phrase, a bit like Shelter from the Storm. So musically, what is Dylan going to do with this song? Well, I'm going to play a verse of it, and then we'll analyze it in more detail. As with Shelter from the Storm, I can't replicate what Dylan does with his voice or instrumentally, but I'll give it my best take on it. Ooh. Let me get in position again. sun was shining, I was laying in bed, wondering if she'd change it all, if the hair was still red. Her folks, they said our lives together sure was gonna be rough. They never did like Mama's homemade dress, Papa's back it was a big one. I was standing at the side of the road, rain pouring down on my shoes, heading up to the East Coast, Lord knows I paid some dues getting through, tangled up in you. So the first thing that will jump out at us as we listen to this is the opening phrase, or the kind of introduction. What's going on here? Well, the first chord, which is a bar, is D, just the chord of D. And in the next chord, which is really interesting, is D suspended fourth. So what that means is in the chord of D, so a suspended chord, I should say, is where, if you think of a chord as being made up of three basic notes, the first, which is the root of the chord, so in the chord of D, that would be D. Then you have a third up from that, which is the third note in D would be F sharp. And then you have the fifth, which would be A in the key of D. So now a suspended chord is usually where you take the third note of the chord and you either move it down to a second from a third, or you move it up to a fourth. So you can hear it here. So we've got the F sharp moving up to a G. And it creates a lovely clash. Why would you want to do this? Well, this is quite a common technique in a lot of music. And by putting this tension right at the beginning of the song, within the very tonic chord that we're beginning with, Dylan's using this dissonance, is trying to create a sense of, tension. He's trying to give us a sense of heightened energy and urgency, because this is in the root chord, the tonic chord of this key. It means that even in the home place, the place of rest, there is no place of rest. There's a restlessness. There's a constant going in and out, in and out. It gives a sense of expectancy, excitement, nervous energy, that something's going to happen, that we need to move. We have to keep going. There's no stopping in this place. There's no single spot where the song's going to end, as it were. Because even in the beginning, it's constantly moving into harmony and disharmony. It also introduces this idea that even in the place where we feel most comfortable here, so in the tonic chord, this should be, musically speaking, the place of safety and warmth, kind of like in Shelter from the Storm. But even there is something not quite right. There's something that needs resolution. And Dylan, that's going to run through the song, that there's this thing that's not quite right, that needs to be solved. So this is kind of the theme of the song. That how are we going to get back to this when it's always like this? It's always this constant interchange. And that's the theme throughout that we'll return to. This kind of restless, nervous energy is produced by this sense that constant motion of the music between the suspended fourth and the simple D. So that's the very beginning of the song. That's where we begin this movement. And then we move into the verse itself, and I'm just going to play the chords. So that gets repeated twice. And this is a really interesting chordal progression. First, you've got the D, so we're back to the home chord. And then we have a C, C, E, G. Now, this is not what you would expect to follow the D. Because in the key of D, we have, for the seventh note, not the note C, but C sharp. This is the proper note for the key of D, but instead we've got C. So this actually creates a clash, doesn't it? Because you've got the C. These would actually clash them. You can hear there's a clash there that should, with what should be there. So why do this? Well, what Dylan's using is a very specific musical mode, which some pop songs use. It's called the Mixolydian mode of music. Remember, I was talking about how in ancient musical theory there was 7 musical modes. These refer to various scales and to ways of playing music. Now, normally we use a major scale, which is also known as the Ionian scale. And so in the key of C, what that means is you've got for a C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That makes your scale. So you've got between C and D a whole tone, between D and E a whole tone, between E and F a semi or half tone, between F and G a whole tone, G and A whole, A and B a whole, and B and C a semi or half tone. That's your standard scale. By contrast, in the Mixolydian scale, you have between C and D a whole, D and E a whole, E and F a whole, E and F a semitone, F and G a whole, G and A a whole. This is where things change. A and B, or A and B flat a half, and B flat and C a whole. So what's happened there is that the only difference between the standard scale and the Mixolydian is the 7th note of the scale has been flattened. So in the key of D, the C sharp has become a C. This changes the intervals which take place within the music, and for our purposes, more importantly, the mood of the music. It gives it a sense of edge, a seriousness, a darkness to it as well, because you've literally lowered the notation of the music. It also introduces some really interesting kind of resolutions. So if we think of the D, the F sharp is going to move down to the E and the G. It's going to move both ways. So we're kind of getting this sense of the suspended chord again, but with C. It sounds similar to there's a musical kind of connection with the suspension there. This is absolutely brilliant choice by Dylan, because not only does it set the tone of the music as serious and dealing with an important theme for him. This isn't just a flight of fancy or a light story. This is one that really made an impact on his narrator, that it's something that matters and is meaningful. It also disorients the audience immediately. It's not what we're expecting. It's in a different, because we're not used to Mixolydian music. We're used to Ionian or major scales or minor scales as well. This isn't what we would expect to be the next chord. Our musical minds have been trained in a different way by most pop music. So when we hear, that's not what we expect to come next. And it thus intensifies this sense of excitement, adventure, restlessness, stepping out into the unknown, the beyond, the mystery of life itself, that it's not fixed, that there's always a new step to be taken, an adventure to be had. It also gives this sense of wide spaces. At least that's how it's been described, the Mixolydian scale, because this interval gives this sense, as I've been saying, of the unknown. Those boundaries are therefore broken. There's many possibilities, and that gives this sense of space. The idea of space ties in with what some people have spoken about with this song, of canvases. Tangled Up in Blue is often described as a painting of various situations. It's bringing them all together in a beautiful way, like a painting. And so the music itself is giving us a sense of a canvas that needs to be written on, which the story of the song is writing on this, or being painted on this musical canvas of openness. So this choice to move through Tangled in Blue in the Mixolydian really enhances this sense of restlessness and the unknown, and of the importance of the song's story for its narrator. So at the end of that sequence, or of that phrase, you heard again a plagal cadence. So the G in the key of D is the fourth chord, and the D is the tonic. So again, Dylan's relying on the plagal cadence here. Again, what this is doing is it's both creating this sense of this is in the past, which is the allusion to the hymns that we were speaking about before, but also the ambiguity around the plagal cadence is being used here to remind the listener implicitly that this is a memory of something that's been lost that the narrator wants to bring back. So let me use a different verse here to kind of reinforce the sense. She lit a burner on the stove and offered me a pie. Thought you'd never say hello, she said. You look like the silent time. Then she opened up a book of poems and handed it to me, written by an Italian poet in the 13th century. So you can see that there's this sense of distance, but also of excited adventure in that, just those couple of lines. Now the first phrase gets completed by the second phrase. So as you would have heard there, you look like the silent tide. Then she opened. So we got that plagal cadence there. The next line answers or resolves the first line. But then the second line gets resolved by a really interesting chord, which Dylan introduces for the first time in this key. So let me turn on my page. So where do we go from here? So that's the next phrase. Really different. Very big changes here. So yeah, maybe it'd be helpful if I sing through that kind of transition. So I'll go from the beginning of another verse, and then you'll hear the transition itself again. I live with them on Montague Street, a basement downstairs. There was music in the cafes at night, revolution in the air. Then he started into dealing with slaves, and something inside of him died. He had to sell everything she owned, and it froze up inside. And when finally the bond fell out, I became withdrawn. The only thing I knew how to do was to keep on keeping on, like the bird that flew. So what happens in this change from the G at the end of the second line, subdominant, is Dylan moves us key. He introduces A major. Now, this is important because the A major is the dominant of the key of D major. But he's moved us out of the Mixolydian key, because, and you can tell this because whereas the Mixolydian flattens the seventh to C, E, and G, in this chord, the C sharp is reintroduced in the A. So that's the C sharp. So he's literally lifted the music here, or made it lighter, in so moving us into D major. This is also the first time that we have a dominant chord in the music. That is the fifth chord. And why does that matter? What's going on here? It brightens the whole thing. It elevates the music. Normally a key change would add a sense of urgency anyway. It's quite a common technique to do that. But by literally lifting the music melodically, it indicates a new thing's happening, that a sense of, well, specifically with, well, there's a sense that we've moved beyond what's been said in the first two lines, and this is becoming more important now. This isn't just a progression in terms of the actual story. So it is telling us the story has progressed a bit here, but also emotionally we've progressed. Things are opening up, emotions being more concretely revealed to the audience. We'll see that as we move on, how that is the case. But there's been a bit of a journey from the beginning of the verse to this point is the next step. Particularly using the dominant. This is a very important chord because it's a definitive, confident, very forthright expression. And it's gives that sense of hope, especially with the brightened C sharp from the C. Oh, we've had, this is something that matters to me. I really loved it, and I want it back. So let me play through. I'll just play the second line into that. So you can see that it's the key change plus into the dominant of D major really introduces a new factor into the song, both kind of in the physical story, the emotional story of the singer, and this is all supplied by the music. Now the next chord again is interesting. So again, this is a new chord for the song. He's not played this before. It's a B minor, which is what we call the relative minor of the tonic, which is D major. So the relative minor is always 6 notes from its major equivalent. So in the key of C, for example, the relative minor is A minor. And this is actually the basis of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. I heard there was a sacred chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. So it's quite common. In the key of G, it is E minor. So you can hear that there's a similarity between these chords, but one is brighter, maybe you could say happier, the other gives a sense of sorrow, sadness, emotional turmoil, something like that. So if we listen to the G, that's quite positive, and then the E minor, there's kind of a note of tension there, or of pain, something like that. So from moving from the A, the A wants to return to the D. That's where it seeks resolution. So again, the authentic cadence would be. That's kind of what we expect or want. But instead, Dylan doesn't give us that. He gives us the relative minor of the D. So this is a kind of, it's a kind of authentic cadence, but with a twist. Instead of being definitive resolution, of confident resolution, of the kind of resolution we want, it's a resolution that's tinged with pain, with sorrow, with suffering. This is where he is now, both in the story, but also emotionally. That's what he's trying to convey with this chordal chain, that it's a sad memory, I guess. Sad emotions coming through here. He then moves us back to the tonic, so we do get there eventually, but only coming through the pain of B minor. And then into the G, so that's the fourth chord again, the subdominant. And that needs an answer. Anything that's not on the tonic needs to find its resolution in the next cadence or the next phrase. But he doesn't give us that immediately. He goes back to the A. So the first time that we hear this, I guess you could say it's musically speaking the third phrase that ends in the G. Then we go back to the phrase again and repeat it, but with a small difference. Whereas the third phrase ends with the G, the fourth phrase goes back to the dominant. So you can hear it again here. So I'll play them both together, and you can hear the second one will end in a different way. Why does Dylan do this? Well, again, he wants to give us a more forceful chord here, because typically these lines, the fourth phrase lines, tend to be the most emotionally explosive, tinged with the most pain, the most revealing, to be honest. Let me give you a few examples. So in the first verse, the line that will end with that A is, "We'll meet again someday on the avenue." This is a man who's clinging to that hope that one day he will get to meet this woman again. The next time, "She never escaped my mind and I just grew." And then obviously Tangled Up in Blue. So this is it's captured his imagination. He can't escape this. And this chord, it conveys that kind of outburst of emotion, which is the song's been building to. In the if we move to the in the first verse, I should say, the line is, "Heading out for the East Coast, Lord knows I've paid some dues getting through." So it's a direct comment on his situation once more. Verse 4, "I must admit I felt a little uneasy when she bent down to tie the laces of my shoe." So again, we're getting this discomfort. It's being revealed to us. Verse 5, this comes from, so I'll read the few lines before. "And every one of them words rang true and glowed like burning coals, pouring off of every page," and this is the key line here, "like it was written in my soul from me to you." So all of that is really nice language before, but then it builds up into this confession of love embodied in this poetry that he's reading. The next line, or the next verse 6, when finally the bottom fell out, I became withdrawn. The only thing I knew how to do, here we go, here's the key phrase for us, was to keep on keeping on like a bird that flew. So again, his nature rises forth out here. It becomes really, really key in understanding the who he is and where he's at. And then finally, the final verse, where this is most explicit. We always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point of view. There's a sort of desperation almost in this line, but also a sense of loss, but hope that, well, the singer believes that he and her did feel the same, that they did have something amazing. She just saw it from a different point of view, is the line that finishes on the dominant. But that gives us then a sense of hope, because maybe her view can change. Maybe we can persuade her that she's wrong on this. Or maybe it's a forlorn hope, but it's still a hope. And it breaks through in a way that the rest of the verse doesn't, because most of, before that, it's about how he wants to get back to her. And then I'm still on the road heading for another joint. This verse comes out of the blue. It doesn't seem to fit with the previous line. It's almost like the rationale of why he's thinking about all of this, why he wants to get back with, or what he's going to try and do, how he can justify trying to get back to her. And that is always on this really definitive, clear, powerful, and strong dominant. So let me do it with that last verse. But me, sorry. Let me get a drink. I'm going to play the last verse because it's so good. So now I'm going back again. I got to get to her somehow. All the people we used to know, they're an illusion to me now. Some are mathematicians, some are carpenters' wives. Don't know how it all got started. I don't know what they do with their lives. For me, I'm still on the road, heading for another joint. We always did feel the same, we just saw it from a different point of view. So you can see how that last bit is really the most forceful bit of the verse because of this dominant, and the most emotionally revealing and explosive from the singers or the narrator. So we've had this, the story has progressed through the verse musically, the narrator's emotions have progressed or reached a very intense point via the music, and then we come to the refrain in every verse. Tangled up in blue. So this is a really interesting phrase, and it goes back to the Mixolydian. It's a kind of, you could say it's a plagal Mixolydian cadence, but let's just stick with the Mixolydian for now. If you remember, Dylan had moved in phrases 3 and 4 into D major with the A chord. So we're back to the A chord here. We're still in D major, and then he moves us to C. And remember, C is in D Mixolydian, it's the flattened 7th. So the A has the C sharp, which is the 7th lifted to the C sharp. That's what we would normally expect. And then he immediately lowers it to C. So again, this gives us this sense of, it disorients us, it catches us off guard, it surprises us with the C. And in some ways it shocks us. It It's not what we expect to come next. Returning to the Mixolydian, he's brought in an element of doubt about this pursuit that he has. It could also be seen as a withdrawal or a sudden coming back into himself, a restraint in some ways. Tangled up in blue. So it's like, before kind of summarizing that bit, the following chords, so you've got the C, then he goes back to the G, so that's the fourth chord, and then the D, so 1. So it's the C, then a plagal cadence. And as we've already spoken about the plagal cadence in Shelter from the Storm, I won't go into too much detail about what it does here. Just it gives that sense again of the safety and warmth, the timelessness, but also the ambiguity of that chord. Continues that this is a memory that he's chasing after. So there's always a degree of uncertainty here. Why return to the Mixolydian beyond just creating a sense of surprise? Well, the whole song is, as we saw in the beginning phrases with the D and the suspension, it's this constant cycle of restlessness that he's always on the road. We see in the penultimate verse, the only thing I knew how to do was to keep on keeping on like a bird that flew. In the next verse, but me, I'm still on the road, heading for another joint. It's this idea that he's constantly living a life on the road. He's constantly in this journey, both in terms of physical location, so he moves about. We see various places throughout. So the East Coast is mentioned. He was heading out to the East Coast. In the next verse, we see that he and this woman drove this car and abandoned it out west. And they go their separate ways. He ends up in the North Woods, but then to New Orleans, and then right out Delacroix. And then he meets her at a topless place, I guess a bar of some kind of strip club. And they go to her home. And then in sixth verse, we end up in Montague Street, where they're living with, I guess it could be her husband. It's not clear. It could be him. It could be in the third person. And then in the seventh verse, it's this return. I'm going back again. I've got to get to her somehow. So there's this physical journey across. It's not, there's some locations defined, but it's quite vague. It could be many places in America, but we could say it's a journey across America for the pursuit of this woman. It's also an emotional journey from the beginning to the end. Particularly that end verse with "we always did feel the same, we just saw it from a different point of view." Very, really, the emotions breaking out at that point, at its most intense. Whereas from the, in the beginning, it's just a kind of, we will meet again someday on the avenue. That there's some emotional power to that, but it's not like really in your face intense. It's more, one day I hope to get back with her. It's a moderate hope. It's a nice thing to think about. But as the song goes on, it becomes more and more open emotionally, more and more forceful, more and more desperate to see her again. So there's this sense of constant journeying throughout the song, this cycle of movement. And we've seen that with the music, melodically, how he signals there's a new thing happening or a progression in the story, emotional and physical story. But bringing it back to Tangled Up in Blue, what's going on here is the journey that he's going on is in a constant loop. I'm always heading to a new place. I'm always on the move. I guess that's the story of life, that we're always traveling further into the unknown. And by returning us to this Tangled Up in Blue phrase, back to the Mixolydian, not to a new key, but returning us from the D major to this darker and more serious key. It's the constraint of always being on the move, that there's no place of rest in this story. Not yet, anyway, because he's not found his love. He's not gone back with her. It returns us back to the beginning of the song. So it's this eternal striving to find rest that we'll never get. That's kind of what that shift does in the music. Not kind of, it does do that. And it's quite a brilliant way of returning us to the endless grind or journey, back to where we've begun, back to the endless cycle keeps going of needing to move in and out, the endless search for rest, but we never quite find it in this life. That's what's so brilliant about it, and that's why it's tangled up in blue. We can never be free of this entangled sorrow, I guess, or restlessness. And so musically, that's what Dylan's done. We reached out into D major, and we've been brought back in. We've been drawn in by the Mixolydian at the beginning of the song. So it's really quite brilliant what he's done there musically. It sounds simple enough. It just sounds like a sequence of chords. Certainly it doesn't, maybe other things sound more impressive, like various Led Zeppelin songs or maybe something by Mark Knopfler. But chordally, the sequence here conveys so much of the meaning of this song. Indeed, lyrically, we can match it up with the melodies with the lyrics in such a way that you can see the atmosphere, the messages, the values he's trying to communicate through the lyrics are there in the chordal progressions too. So with all of that, let me sing the final verse again so that you can maybe reflect on some of these things that I've been talking about, and maybe hear them and appreciate them in a new light. And I'd encourage all of you after this to go away and listen to Shelter from the Storm and Tangled Up in Blue, and just appreciate the brilliance of these pieces of music as pieces of music, not just for the words. So now I'm going back again. I got to get to her somehow. All the people we used to know, they're an illusion to me now. Some are mathematicians, some are carpenters' wives. Don't know how it all got started. I don't know what we'll do with their lives. Me, I'm still on the road, heading for another joy. We always did feel the same, we just saw it from a different point. Tangled up in the blue. I should also say as well, is that, the rhythm is really key here as well. It's very upbeat, it's tempo strong, and so that gives that sense of constant journey or movement and propulsion, as the key changes do, as the Mixolydian key does. It's all part of it. And the instrumentation as well that he uses on Blood on the Tracks, with the drum, with the bass, it adds this sense of moving forwards, constant moving forwards. So yeah, I think that that's probably the best place to leave Tangled Up in Blue. I'm going to look at the comments now. Feel free to put any more questions or comments in the chat, and I'll have a look at them. So let's see, where did we get to in this? Thank you, Matthew. I much appreciate you staying up for this. Means a lot. Means a lot that you wanted to listen and engage. It's yeah, I'm really thankful for the folks who listen in and tune in and be a part of the stream. Thank you, JD. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on Dylan as a songwriter as well, because I think that's the thing. Like, if you write songs yourself, you'll probably have a lot more insight as well into the actual process of building a song and what it would take to even think in the way Dylan does about Tangled Up in Blue and Shelter from the Storm. You know, I play a wee bit of music and I've sung quite a bit, but I'm I'm a very I've written like one or two really basic songs. I can't even imagine like the Mixolydian key. To me, that's just a whole way of thinking I could never get round at this point. So it'd be really interesting to hear like actual songwriters talk about this stuff and how Dylan's the innovation and ingenuity of Dylan's musical choices in this album, uh, and other artists as well. I mean, Bowie is another one that would be fantastic to do. Indeed, something like Ashes to Ashes sounds really great, but there's a lot of musical complexity going on in that song, or Life on Mars as well. It's really quite stunning in that regard, in terms of chordal progressions. Or then if you look at a group like Led Zeppelin, I think their song Communication Breakdown, it's chordally probably not the most complicated, but if you look at what they do in terms of developing themes, I think it's absolutely amazing. Roger Scruton, he speaks about, one of the things in terms of ranking music or assessing the brilliance of a piece of music is how does it take its beginning kind of materials musically and then develop them in interesting directions. Now, what you could say against most, like the Dylan songs here, is that there's no real musical development. There is a really interesting chord sequence in both and melodic sequences as well, but he doesn't then change them or alter them or try and expand upon them in interesting avenues. It's the same thing repeated over and over again. That makes a lot of sense because the words are the focus. Going back to the Renaissance humanism and Reformation stuff we were talking about earlier. But what that means is it has limited musical brilliance. It's really good. It's absolutely fantastic for what Dylan's trying to do in terms of writing, I guess, pop songs, for want of a better word. But in terms of like musical excellence, it can't compete with something like Mozart or Beethoven because it doesn't attempt to develop the initial theme. Most music doesn't do that. Most song music doesn't try. Whereas if I'm right in saying it's Communication Breakdown, I might be. It's one of the early Led Zeppelin songs, but certainly other ones would count. They develop their themes. It's only a 3-minute song, but it moves through various extensions of the original ideas in terms of the guitar part, the bass, the drums, and so to me that's really ticking a lot of boxes. I guess prog rock does a lot of this, and Pink Floyd would be a good example, or Yes, or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, perhaps. But that Led Zeppelin song, because it's 3 minutes, it's doing something quite amazing, developing themes. So there's a whole range of things to look at beyond just these couple of songs that might be worth exploring. And I think there's certainly room online to do that because on the one hand, you either get lyrical evaluations or you get quite vague evaluations. And I appreciate some of my commentary might have been a wee bit vague at points, but I've tried to root it in specific musical changes taking place in these songs. Or there's like learn how to play this song. There's not really how does the music of these songs, like the actual technical examination of this music, impact our experience of this song. So there's a lot of room there. I've given you quite the challenge, JD. John, that's very kind of you. I'm not quite sure how my English accent sounds more American. Uh, Maybe it's just the way I sing the song. It's quite tempting to fall into an American accent when you sing. Um, but I think one of the things that I've realized with Dylan is that if I was ever to sing in public, I might sing Dylan, but I wouldn't do it as a tribute act because, well, typically a tribute act tries to imitate, and I don't think you can imitate. There's been a lot of covers of Dylan which try to sound like him in some ways, even if unintentionally. Thinking of like Brian Ferry's album, for example, or there was an album that was done for like, was it a kind of charity thing? There was loads of different artists did it, and a lot of them tried to sound like Dylan, but you can't because he's so unique and innovative and in his interpretation of his songs that to try and be an imitation is just impossible. You can never live up to it, especially in this day and age where people could just go online and listen to it for free on YouTube. So if I'm ever to sing, it won't be as a tribute act, but I would do it with my own spin, I guess. Do it to the best of the way I can sing it, and that's what I'd encourage other people to do. Heading for another joint, an allusion to the never-ending tour. I'm not sure. Let me just go on Google and see when Never-Ending Tour began. I'm afraid not, because the Never-Ending Tour began in 1988, and this song is in the 70s. So I don't think it's referring to that in particular, but it could certainly refer to. I mean, Dylan was constantly on the move. And there's various tours like the Rolling Thunder tour is only a few years after this. Um, Certainly growing up as well, he was often traveling the country, spending time with bohemians and moving around the place, not fixed to any certain location. So that's certainly a part of it. So I wouldn't want to. I think touring's probably there, but it's not the never-ending tour. Um, but also, we're all on an kind of heading for another joint. I think that's part of the brilliance of this song, that even if you remove the love angle from it, although that's very important, in this life we're always seeking our final end, which in Christian theology is only ever in God in the afterlife, in the beatific vision. Before that, we're always in a state of restlessness. Uh, Augustine has a really great quote on this from the Confessions. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. This idea you can see in American literature most clearly in John Kerouac's The Road, since that we're not in a defined place, we're just in a place of always transition, always moving forward, um, carrying with us the past, looking back to it, but always into the unknown future. And even in those things that we find comfort, there's always a propulsion within us that strives for something more complete, the infinite and everlasting satisfaction that comes from union with God. And if we don't believe in God, some people may not who are listening, well, then we're always striving, we're always moving with no definite end in sight. That's part of the brilliance of this song, that the love that the narrator has for this woman, well, that could stand for any final end, anything that we're seeking for or desiring or chasing after. And even if we find it, it's never going to be perfect, and we'll keep moving on, like a bird that flew. That's part of the brilliance, and I think it wakes us up to our human nature in that regard, or human creation. It's it's not a static thing. Often we think of ourselves as quite static, living in homes, working in certain buildings, and so on. But we're always on this journey. It's truly stunning. Let's see, John. Are you familiar with the musical style of doo-wop? Here's a great example of this God-filled music, Baby Oh Baby by the Shells. I know of doo-wop, but I don't know that song, and I will search for it after this stream. Yeah, so that's all the comments. Feel free to put any more in while I just share a couple of things before wrapping up. So I'm thinking of moving the before I talk about that, first just to say I don't know if some of you may have missed this at the beginning, but I've got a new microphone, and I've been using it for the first time today. So let me know if it sounds good and if it sounds a lot better than my previous streams, because I'm really hoping it does. It should be a lot clearer and softer and not popping and kind of scratching and all this sort of thing. So please let me know. I'd really appreciate that. And also if it's like at a good volume level or if I need to kind of change how loud it is. I'd really appreciate that. Beyond that, so I'm thinking of future streams. There's lots and lots of things that I'd love to talk about. There's so many topics to engage with. My thinking is that I'll, at maximum, do 2 streams a month now. Work's pretty busy at the moment, and it takes quite a while to put these streams together. I really enjoy doing it. It's one of my favorite things to do, but it's just not feasible to do more than 2 a month. It may even go down to 1 a month, depending on how things are. So they'll be a bit less frequent, but hopefully I'll be able to keep them going. And also, I'm going to do them at 2 different times because I've done this afternoon slot from 3, and I really want to keep that because I know a lot of people, especially like the Australians, Lady of Shalott, I don't think she's here today. She's one of them. They can only really tune in at this time, and it's much better for them. So I want to keep one at 3, but also the other one will be in the evenings on a Saturday. Just because I think there's another group of people who want to tune in who can more easily do it then. So we'll do 1 at 3, 1 at 7. Future streams, ideas, well, there's lots, but one of them, perhaps the next one, is going to be looking at, well, there's a couple of ideas. I'll just outline them. So one of them is in ancient and medieval thought, there was an idea of how to quantify emotion, and particularly sin, with the notion of pre-emotions, and how we can control our instinctual urges to evil desire. So I think that would be quite interesting because it gives a whole different take on the nature of humanity and runs against a lot of modern views of emotion, but also is just an interesting set of conceptual categories that to play around with. Another stream I plan to do will look at, and it's related, is how non-rational things impact our emotions and thus are key for spiritual transformation. It's not just having the right beliefs, it's also going to be what rituals you do, what behaviors you're engaged in, so on and so forth. And then a third stream I hope to do soon is on this idea that, and this is probably the most controversial of the 3, is that globalization, well, that's a massive term and has lots of definitions, but it's beyond just political kind of multiculturalism. It also includes things like connections across the world. So YouTube's an example of globalization, trade with other countries, and so on. These are examples of globalization. So many things we call globalization are here to stay for the foreseeable future, but we still don't really have a sense of how we can do this right, because on the one hand, those who push globalization as a political project tend to want to create one world culture and in the name of diversity eliminate genuine differences of culture, if they conflict with their values of kind of liberal tolerance. So if you have a belief system which clashes with American liberalism, then that has to go, even in the name of diversity. On the other hand, it's untenable to maintain the position, at least in my view, that we can resist all of globalization, or we can go back to a prior age, kind of like Peter Hitchens' 1960s dream of a conservative England again. It's a myth. It can't happen. We've been changed too much, and I can't conceive of a world without some aspects of globalization. And not all of globalization's been bad. One of the great things is YouTube, for example. It's allowed communities from all over the world who share similar interests to engage with each other. So the stream's going to look at what can be a good way forward, what cultural force can both create unity across the world in terms of globalization, but also allow for difference, different cultures, different ways of life within this unity, in this, for want of a better word, one world culture, although I don't think that would be the right way of putting it. A globalized world, a globalized society. So what would that mean? Well, in my view, Christianity is the only phenomenon which can provide both the unifying factor between different cultures experiencing globalization, whilst at the same time maintaining the fundamental differences of culture across the world, thus keeping the universal and the particular together. So that will be another stream. That was a long-winded way of explaining that. I'm sorry for that. But yeah, so those may be popping up, and other things might pop up too. Yeah, so thank you, John and Matthew, for letting me know about the mic. That's really great. I'm really glad to hear that. So thank you. Well, if there are no more comments, all there remains to do is to say thank you again for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this stream. And maybe in the future, we'll do some more musical deep dives on other songs. If there's any particular Dylan songs or other songs that you would be interested in hearing examination of, feel free to drop them in the comments after this video, and I'll consider it. It also depends on how, like, my musical level is okay, but it's not brilliant, so I'm not going to be able to do like Beethoven's Fifth. But if it's a pop song of some kind, I might be able to give it a shot. I hope you have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and as ever, may God's grace be with you, and may he give you every good wish. Till next time, God bless, my friends.